He was supposed to return. Every oracle said so. Every seer, every harrow spread, every prophetic dream for 1,000 years pointed to the same moment. And then 4606 came, and he simply ceased to be. 1. The Last Azlanti. What Aroden represented to the civilizations of the Inner Sea mattered more than any divine portfolio or holy symbol. He was the last living thread connecting the world to Azlant, the first great human empire, which sank beneath the waves during Earthfall roughly 10,000 years before the present day. When the sky fell and the age went dark, Azlant went with it. Aroden did not. He survived. Across centuries that would have ground any ordinary mortal to dust, Aroden preserved his own life through methods the texts never fully explain. He wandered Golarion, watched civilizations rise and collapse, and carried the memory of Azlant as a living inheritance. That made him something no other being on Golarion could claim to be, a direct, breathing connection to humanity's highest ancient achievement. He remembered what had been lost. His divine ascension came through the Starstone, the same object that had fallen to Golarion during Earthfall and come to rest on the floor of the Inner Sea. Aroden walked into the depths and retrieved it. He raised it from the water and placed it at the center of what would become the Isle of Kortos. Then he passed the test of the Starstone, the impossible divine trial embedded within the stone itself. He was the first mortal in recorded history to do so, and the act transformed him into a god. From the Starstone's resting place, he raised the Isle of Kortos out of the sea and founded the city of Absalom upon it. The city was built as a monument to human civilization, a place where all the world's peoples could come together under the protection of a god who had once been one of them. The calendar of the Inner Sea region, known as Absalom Reckoning, counts its years from the moment Aroden raised the Isle of Kortos. Everything in Inner Sea history is measured from that act. 2. God of humanity and history. As a deity, Aroden's domain covered humanity, history, and the cycle of civilization, each understood as facets of a single project. He was the Last Azlanti, protector of human potential, keeper of what had been built and lost before. His clerics preserved records, advanced the arts and sciences of governance, and spread the conviction that humanity's greatest days were still ahead of it. His primary earthly champion was the nation of Cheliax. At its height, the Cheliaxian Empire was the dominant human power in the western Inner Sea, and Aroden was its divine patron and state religion. The Cheliaxian emperors ruled with Aroden's blessing, and the empire's expansion was framed as a holy mandate, the spread of civilization under the god's watchful eye. The Church of Aroden was vast, wealthy, and deeply embedded in Cheliaxian political life. Yomade had risen through the ranks of the Knights of Ozum, distinguished herself in the shining crusade against Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant, and passed her own test of the Starstone in 3832 AR. That ascension made her a full deity, and Aroden took her as his divine herald. She was already a goddess by the time he died, a separate divine power with her own standing and her own following. By the early 4600s AR, Aroden sat at the center of the Inner Sea's religious and political life. Multiple nations, institutions, and entire civilizational projects had been built around his teachings. The Church was one of the largest religious organizations on Golarion, and beyond all of that, there was the prophecy. 3. The prophecy of his return. Seers had been predicting Aroden's physical return to Golarion for centuries. The prophecies were consistent across unrelated traditions, cultures, and methods of divination. Cheliaxian court prophets, Varisian harrow readers, independent oracles, and distant nations, scholars within the Iomedaean Church who had cataloged the accumulated prophecies of his return, all pointed to the same conclusion. Sometime around 4606 AR, Aroden would step back onto mortal soil. The convergence on that window was remarkable and widely accepted. What he was supposed to do upon returning is harder to pin down with precision. Some traditions described a returning god-king who would take a direct hand in governing the mortal world, ushering in an era of unchallenged civilization. Others framed it as a great final battle, a confrontation with darkness that Aroden would lead and win. The details varied, but the underlying assumption was consistent. His return would be triumphant and transformative. Cheliax prepared. The Church of Aroden prepared. The knights and paladins who served under the banner of the Last Azlanti sharpened their swords and waited. The year 4606 AR arrived. It arrived, and Aroden died. 4606 AR, the year of the god's death. His clerics felt it before anyone else. Their spells went dead. The divine connection they had maintained for years simply severed. There was no signal event anyone could point to as the cause. Then came the storms. The weather across the Inner Sea region turned catastrophic and stayed that way for roughly a century. Hurricane-force storms, unnatural lightning, floods, and gales battered coastlines and trade routes. Ships sank. Harvests failed. Coastal cities were battered for years. The world did not mourn quietly. The Eye of Abendigo formed off the western coast of Garund in the Fever Sea and has never dissipated. This permanent hurricane rotates endlessly, a storm that cannot be dispersed by any natural or magical means yet discovered. It destroyed the nations of Lurgan and Yamasa outright. Their populations were scattered or killed. What had been populated coastline became the Sodden Lands, a waterlogged, ruined stretch of territory under permanent assault from the Eternal Storm's outer bands. The Eye still turns today. It has turned for over 100 years. It is simply there, a permanent scar on the face of the world, marking the moment a god died. 5. The collapse of Cheliax. The collapse of Cheliax was the most far-reaching immediate consequence of Aroden's death. The Empire had built its entire legitimacy around Aroden's divine favor. The imperial family ruled because Aroden willed it. The Church of Aroden provided the Empire's moral framework. When the god died, both of those foundations evaporated simultaneously. The result was decades of civil war. Without a clear divine mandate backing any single claimant, the noble houses of Cheliax turned on each other. The Church collapsed as its clerics lost their connection to their dead god. The Empire began to fragment at its edges as distant territories took advantage of the chaos to assert independence. Nations that had been Chelaxian provinces for generations broke away. The war was long, bloody, and ideologically confused. House Thrune eventually ended it, and the manner in which they did so defined Cheliax for the next century. The Thrunes turned to Hell. Through infernal pacts with Asmodeus and the powers of Hell, House Thrune secured the diabolic military and magical support necessary to crush their rivals and claim the throne. In exchange, Cheliax became a nation formally dedicated to Asmodeus. The nation that had been the greatest champion of humanity's patron god became, within a generation of his death, a devil-worshipping autocracy. The Church of Asmodeus became the state religion. West Crown, the old imperial capital, was sidelined as the Thrunes built their government around Agorian, their new seat of power. Infernal bureaucracy replaced the old civic religion. The Hell Knights, a collection of rigid martial orders that had existed before the Civil War but expanded dramatically under the Diabolus state, grew to become one of the Inner Sea's most feared military institutions. What Cheliax had been under Aroden and what it became under Thrune are about as far apart as a civilization can travel in 100 years. 6. The breaking of prophecy. Aroden's death broke something beyond politics. Prophecy stopped working. Before 4606 AR, it worked. Oracles could see the future with reasonable accuracy. Harrow spreads gave genuine insight into events to come. Seers who devoted their lives to reading the threads of fate produced predictions that consistently bore out. The entire tradition of prophetic divination in the Inner Sea region was built on the assumption that the future was coherent and, with sufficient skill, legible. After Aroden's death, the predictions became contradictory, vague, or simply wrong in ways they never were before. A seer might receive a vision with perfect clarity and watch it fail to materialize entirely. Another might describe 5 possible futures with equal conviction, with no way to determine which was real. Scholars have debated why this happened. The most widely accepted theory is that Aroden, as the god of history, was in some fundamental way the anchor of causality's legibility. He was the keeper of the record of what had been and what was coming, and his death disrupted the coherent shape of the future. Without that anchor, the future lost its fixed character entirely. Other scholars argue that the breaking of prophecy was a side effect of the same catastrophic event that killed a major deity, a kind of magical shockwave that permanently damaged the divinatory fabric of the world. Prophecy cannot be trusted. Plans built on prophetic certainty collapse. Institutions that had relied on divine foreknowledge found themselves operating on guesswork. The Age of Lost Omens takes its name from that collapse. 7. The Worldwound. The same year Aroden died, the ground tore open in the nation of Sarkoris. The Worldwound is a rift directly into the abyss, the infinite outer plane of demonic chaos. It opened in 4606 AR, and demons poured through it in overwhelming numbers. Sarkoris, a northern nation of shamanistic traditions and primal magic, was simply overrun. Its people were killed or scattered. The demons spread outward from the rift, corrupting the landscape into a spreading blight of warped terrain, chaotic magical effects, and perpetual demonic infestation. Whether the Worldwound's opening was directly caused by Aroden's death, timed to coincide with it by demonic forces, or simply a coincidence of the same turbulent period, is something scholars have argued about ever since. The timing is too precise to dismiss. A major divine death and a massive breach of reality opening in the same year suggests a connection, but the exact nature of that connection has never been definitively established. The Worldwound drove a series of military crusades. Local forces fought from the moment the rift opened, but the organized First Mendevian Crusade did not launch until around 4622 AR, 16 years after the Worldwound appeared. Crusade followed crusade over the next century as the faithful of Yomadai and other good-aligned deities tried to push back the demonic tide. The crusades were partly successful, containing the Worldwound to what had been Sarkoris, but they could not close it. The rift required the Wardstones, a network of divine artifacts planted around the Worldwound's perimeter, to prevent the demons from spreading further. Maintaining them required constant vigilance and lives. The Worldwound was ultimately sealed in 4718 AR through a combination of extraordinary heroism and the severing of the demonic power sustaining the rift. The land of what had been Sarkoris was not restored, and significant demonic corruption remained in the area now called the Sarkoris Scar. But the breach into the abyss was closed. It had taken over a century. 8. Iomedae and the Inheritance. Iomedae's position in the aftermath was stranger than anyone else's. She had been Aroden's herald, a full deity in her own right who had passed the test of the Starstone on her own merit in 3832 AR. When he died, she survived it. She was already a separate divine power with her own standing. The mass of Aroden's former worshippers turned to Iomedae. Not all of them, and not all at once, but the flow of faith moved in her direction. The paladins who had served under Aroden's banner found in her a goddess whose values fit what they had already been fighting for. She was the inheritor, and the title was apt. She inherited the moral weight of Aroden's legacy even as she could not inherit his mysteries or his history. The Mendevian Crusades against the Worldwound became closely associated with Iomedae's church. Her clerics kept the wounded alive while her paladins held the front lines, and her faith became the organizing spiritual principle of the crusading movement in a way that the shattered remnants of Aroden's church could no longer provide. Iomedae absorbed much of what Aroden had represented while shaping it into something distinctly her own. Aroden's remaining clergy, those who did not transfer their devotion to Iomedae or another deity, largely faded over the following decades. Some continued to practice as best they could, their spells failing without a divine source to power them, keeping the old rites as a matter of tradition rather than functional faith. The Church of Aroden as an institution is, for practical purposes, gone. 9. The Age of Lost Omens. The current age in the Inner Sea region is defined by what was broken in 4606 AR. The Age of Lost Omens is the period following Aroden's death, and the name captures its essential character. This is an age in which the future cannot be read. The great prophetic traditions are unreliable. The divine certainties that had structured political life for centuries are gone or transformed. The world moves forward without the guidance it once had. Noble houses that once justified their rule through divine mandate scramble for new legitimations. Military campaigns that would once have been preceded by prophetic consultation now go forward on ordinary intelligence and guesswork. Religious institutions that built their credibility around accurate prophecy have had to find other foundations. The entire relationship between the mortal world and the divine has shifted. Organizations dedicated to direct exploration and empirical documentation found themselves newly relevant. The Pathfinder Society, dedicated to exploring, documenting, and sharing knowledge of the world's history and wonders, grew in importance as prophecy failed. Without the future available to read, the past became the primary resource. The Society's Pathfinder spread across Golarion in greater numbers than before, cataloging ruins, recovering lost history, and building the kind of empirical knowledge base that oracles had once been expected to provide. Other powers adapted in other ways. The Aspis Consortium, a ruthless mercantile organization, filled economic vacuums left by the collapse of old Cheliaxian trade networks. Varisia, long considered a backwater, became a focus of intense scholarly interest as the ruins of ancient Thassalon were rediscovered, offering a window into a magical civilization that predated Earthfall. The Shackles, already a region of piracy and free captain culture, grew more entrenched and ungovernable as Cheliaxian naval power collapsed. Nidal, a Cheliaxian vassal nation whose ruling umbral court had bound the entire country to the shadow deity Zon-Kuthon through an ancient pact made during the Age of Darkness, consolidated its own position as Cheliaxian power collapsed around it. The rise of Tar-Baphon added another layer to the Age's dark accounting. The Whispering Tyrant had history with Aroden. The gods struck down the mortal necromancer Tar-Baphon around 896 AR, long before the Lich's second rise. Tar-Baphon returned as an undead tyrant, and it was the Knights of Ozum who finally imprisoned him in Gallowspire at the close of the Shining Crusade in 3827 AR. The nation of Last Wall was built around keeping him contained. With Aroden now dead, the god who had once killed him was gone. Tar-Baphon escaped Gallowspire in 4719 AR. His escape and the subsequent destruction of Last Wall created the Gravelands, a vast stretch of undead-dominated territory in central Avestan. The man Aroden killed once came back twice, and there is no Aroden left to face him a third time. X. The question that has no answer. The death of Aroden remains officially unexplained. Paizo made a deliberate decision to leave the cause of his death ambiguous within the canon of the game world. The mystery was intentional. In an age without reliable prophecy, the foundational event of that age should itself be unresolvable. Some theologians argue that Rovagug, the god of destruction imprisoned at the world's core, reached out and destroyed Aroden from within his prison. Others point to Asmodeus, whose church benefited enormously from Cheliax's fall and whose reputation for long-term infernal scheming makes him a plausible suspect in a god murder. Some scholars suggest that Aroden's power was simply depleted over the millennia, that a god can die of a kind of divine exhaustion when his worshippers' needs outpace the faith sustaining him. A smaller but persistent school argues that Aroden chose death, that he deliberately stepped away from divinity for reasons no mortal mind has yet reconstructed. None have been confirmed and none have been ruled out. The truth, if it survives somewhere in Golarion's cosmology, has not been found. That ambiguity fits the age it created. The god who kept history died without explanation, and the record of what actually happened to him may be the one historical question that never gets answered. Absalom still stands. The Starstone still rests within its cathedral, waiting. 3 other mortals passed its test in the centuries before his death: Caden Kalin, Norgorber, and Iomade. The stone does not care that the man who raised it from the deep is gone. It endures, and the city built on the isle he raised endures around it. Whether that means anything or not is a question the Age of Lost Omens cannot answer.